For me, before we can think about breaking the bias, there needs to be an acknowledgement from everyone that a bias actually exists. There needs to be education in that space, and then we can go about breaking it.
It means disassembling all of the default and the preconceived notions we have about who's successful, what success looks like, and who gets to make the decisions.
To me, I would say being in a world where being different is something that can be valued and something that can be celebrated. By experience, being on the unconscious bias train that Emily Driver does, it's certainly an eye-opener when it comes to how stereotypes and discrimination is a massive problem worldwide, and it's something that we need to overcome.
Breaking the bias means to me working towards a world where there is no stereotypes, no discrimination, there's inclusivity, and we all value our differences. Collectively, we can break the bias.
Challenging conventions and finding your own way.
So to me, breaking the bias is looking beyond gender and actually evaluating people on what they can bring to the table, what skills they have, what experience they have, and just what they can contribute to society.
So for me, breaking the bias is all about being able to call out when something is wrong, and I think for me it's important to work in a company that is committed to challenging gender bias and encourages its staff to do so. I also think law is historically a very male-dominated area, and so I think it's really encouraging that we have 2 female managing directors that our staff can look up to. And I think finally, breaking the bias for me, as the mother of a 2-year-old little impressionable boy, I think it's about teaching him that it's important to challenge gender bias, and hopefully that's something that I'm able to do so in the future. He's not afraid to call out if something's wrong.
So men can no longer be bystanders, but now must actively fight against gender inequality.
So breaking the bias to me, when I was thinking about this, is firstly not thinking about bias as 2 sides. I think we have an instinct sometimes to think one side think this, the other side think that, and one side is right and one side is wrong. So it's how do we understand actually where does bias come from? And actually it's probably more about misunderstanding or miscommunication or lack of communication, and therefore how do you work through that? And therefore it's also everybody working together, I think. So I listened to a woman talk at one point about various things, but one of the things she talked about was for women to get the vote, men in Parliament had to vote for it. So that idea that there were different sides and different thoughts, etc. I think the idea that we all have to work together probably, for me, is a starting point to begin to break the bias, because then you understand how you have to go about doing that.
Having the same career opportunities and mobility at work.
Breaking bias is something we should all be doing. Sometimes women make themselves small and they don't want to say no because it's easier. And I think if we don't stand up and make a change, if we don't break the bias, then I don't want future generations to feel like they can't achieve in life purely because of the gender. So we all have to break the bias now to make a change for the future.
It means to be taking up more space as a woman and not minimising ourselves to fit traditional gender stereotypes.
Equality for men and women.
Not assuming a man can do a better job than a woman.
So breaking the bias for me means fighting for a world free of stereotypes and discrimination, and living in a world that is inclusive and it encourages equality both within and outside the workplace.
To me, it basically means that I think both men and women should be treated equally. They should have equal rights, equal pays. For example, simplest thing you learn as a childhood level, your mom and dad are equals. Why should it be different outside of that scenario? So it's all about equality.
So for me, breaking the bias means that being a woman is more about upliftance, community and self-respect than it is about gender. I think these days there is way too much of a focus on what makes a real woman, what being a real woman means, that kind of thing, and it's more of a kinship and a sisterhood and supporting each other and being there for each other.
For me, it's about exceeding expectations. I was 19 years old when I had my little girl working in Primark, so people automatically make an assumption about you. People make assumptions about you before you even met you in the first 2 seconds. So I think you have to push the boundaries, break the mould, and push yourself. So instead of settling for what I already had, I decided I wanted more. For myself and for my little girl who were here. So I had 2 kids, I enrolled at Open Uni, so I was studying and working at the same time. And then I went a step further after I got my degree and got my masters, and now I work here, which is like I'd have never ever thought going from one point to the other. But people along the way make assumptions, so even in my masters I got told, because I've got kids, I will never work in like a high-end firm. I should always settle for whatever I can get, and it just shows what people think and what people say. They might not realise what they say, but I always decide to push them boundaries, and that's what I think it's about. I think it's accomplishments.
Just as with many social issues, I think that with gender bias, you can't just be safe in the knowledge that the bias exists. You have to actually take action to break the bias. And one thing that we can do to do that is to take responsibility for our thoughts and our actions every single day and take full accountability for those. And then another thing that we can do is keep educating ourselves, keep learning about those issues that go to the root of why we live in an unequal world.
So it's my opinion that the bias will never be broken. I think that it's human nature to have biases and feelings about certain things. And I think that we have to accept that everybody's different and that can affect our perceptions. But we all have an individual responsibility to make sure that we're confronting those biases and working on how we treat other people to ensure that the biases don't mean that we treat others differently when it's not legitimate to do so.